All right, so let's get right into it today. Um, will Russia attack Europe after Ukraine? That's the question we're going to try to answer in this deep dive. And we've got a lot of material to go through. We've got intelligence reports, expert opinions, and some economic analysis to really see if we can figure this out.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it's not just your classic kind of warfare. This is what they call hybrid warfare.
Right.
It's a lot more complex. It's a mix of things like cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns. So it makes predicting Russia's next move a lot harder.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So before we get into the specifics, I think it's helpful to define some key terms that are going to come up a lot. We're going to be talking about things like offensive, which in this case refers to like a military attack. Then there's deterrence, which is basically trying to prevent an action by making the consequences seem really scary. And then there's escalation, which means things are getting more intense.
Yeah, those are all really important terms. And then on the economic side, we're going to be talking about things like sanctions, which are essentially penalties that are placed on a country. We're going to be looking at how sanctions are affecting Russia's economy.
Right. Okay, so now that we've got our vocabulary down, let's look at some recent events. So let's start with kind of the elephant in the room, President Zelensky's warning at the Munich Security Conference.
Right.
He basically said that he believes Russia might use Belarus, just like they did before invading Ukraine, as like a springboard to attack a NATO country. And get this, he said this could happen as early as 2025.
Wow. Yeah, it's a chilling prediction, and it's not just coming from Zelensky. Latvian intelligence, for example, has reported that Russia seems to be intentionally building up its military capacity for a possible conflict with NATO. And German intelligence officials have kind of echoed these concerns, suggesting that Russia could be capable of launching an attack on a NATO country by the end of the decade.
So it's not just some theory out there, multiple agencies are kind of raising a red flag.
Exactly. And if that wasn't enough, Danish intelligence has painted an even, more ominous picture.
Oh no.
Yeah, they suggest that depending on how and when the war in Ukraine ends, Russia could be capable of launching a range of attacks in Europe. Anything from a limited, local conflict to like a full-blown large-scale war.
Okay, that's pretty unsettling. But here's the thing I don't get. Isn't Russia already struggling in Ukraine? Like their army is exhausted, their economy is a disaster,
Right.
the ruble's worth less than a penny at this point, and they're facing this demographic crisis.
Right.
Like, wouldn't launching another war just make things even worse?
Yeah, on the surface, it does seem improbable.
Right.
But there are a few really crucial factors that analysts are thinking about. For one, imagine a peace deal in Ukraine that really favors Russia.
You mean like Putin gets what he wants and kind of claims victory?
Precisely. And with the current U.S. administration's, willingness to negotiate with Putin, this isn't totally out of the realm of possibility. A deal like that one that lets Russia rebuild its economy and, kind of save face could actually embolden them to set their sights on another target.
So a peace deal could actually make things even more dangerous.
Yeah.
That's a scary thought.
It's a paradoxical possibility, for sure, and we can't ignore the fact that Russia is already engaging in this escalating hybrid warfare campaign across Europe.
You mean like all the fiber attacks we've been hearing about?
Exactly, and disruptions to undersea cables, disinformation campaigns, it goes on and on.
Right?
These actions could be a way for Russia to test the waters, to probe for weaknesses, or even to provoke a reaction that escalates into a full-blown conflict.
It's like they're poking the bear hoping it'll lash out.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And then there's this added layer of uncertainty surrounding NATO, former President Trump's constant criticism of NATO, and his talk of withdrawing U.S. troops from Europe have really sowed seeds of doubt about the alliance's commitment to defending its members. This lack of clarity could embolden Russia to push the boundaries and test NATO's resolve, potentially leading to a much larger confrontation.
Okay, so this is all starting to seem pretty bleak. It's like we're walking this tightrope between trying to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine and potentially causing a wider conflict.
Yeah, it's a really delicate balance to be sure. And to understand this complex situation, it helps to understand some of the language that's being used.
You mean like learning to speak geopolitics? I'm all ears.
Well, for instance, you'll often hear phrases like, under the guise of, for example, Russia might send troops to Belarus under the guise of military exercises. This idiom implies that there's more to the story, that the real intentions might be hidden.
It's like they're trying to pull a fast one, using this seemingly innocent explanation to cover up something more sinister.
Exactly. Or let's take the phrase carry out. You'll hear experts warn about Russia carrying out attacks on NATO countries. This isn't just about any random act of aggression. It emphasizes a very calculated and deliberate action, often with a military objective in mind.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but the weight they carry in this context.
Precisely. And this is where resources like FunFluent can be really helpful. They use movies and TV shows to teach English, which can make learning these nuances of language a lot more engaging and memorable.
That's a great point. It's one thing to memorize the definition from a dictionary or something,
Yeah.
but it's a whole other thing to hear how that word or phrase is actually used in a real-world scenario.
Absolutely. And speaking of real world scenarios, let's shift gears a bit and look at the other side of the coin. Why might Putin hesitate to launch another attack, even with all the things we've talked about? Well, first of all, Russia's military advances in Ukraine haven't exactly been swift and decisive.
Like,
I mean, they've gained some territory, but it's been really brutal and costly. And launching another war, especially against a stronger opponent like NATO,
right?
would put so much strain on their resources.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to run a marathon but with a sprained ankle.
Exactly.
They might be able to limp along for a while,
Right.
but they're eventually going to just collapse.
That's a great analogy. And then, there's the economic strain we talked about earlier. Launching another war would be like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire.
Oh, yeah,
Inflation is out of control. The ruble is practically worthless, and their population problem is only getting worse.
right.
It's really hard to see how they could handle another long conflict without facing some pretty serious consequences at home.
So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
Their war machine is working overtime, but they're running out of fuel to keep it going.
Right. It's a catch-22, and that's why some analysts think Russia might feel pressure to act sooner rather than later while they're still able to make weapons and equipment.
Right.
It's a dangerous gamble, but one that Putin might be willing to take.
It is a terrifying thought, but it's also hard to really grasp just how much destruction another war would cause. We've been talking about economics and the military, but what about the human cost?
Right.
It's easy to get lost in this strategy and forget that there are real people whose lives are at stake.
Absolutely. That's something we can't overlook, behind all the politics and military stuff are real people, families torn apart, homes destroyed, and countless lives lost or forever changed by the violence.
Right? It's a reminder that these geopolitical games have real-world consequences.
Yeah.
And those consequences are often felt by everyday people who have no say in the matter.
Exactly. And it's not even just about the immediate impact of war. You have to think about the long-term effects.
Yeah.
The trauma, the economic damage, the political instability. It could take generations to recover.
It's like a shock wave that continues to affect things long after the initial blast.
That's a powerful image. And speaking of powerful images, let's explore some of the language used to describe this potential conflict. Understanding the nuances of these terms can help us really understand how serious the situation is.
Okay, I'm all for expanding my geopolitical vocabulary. What do you got?
Well, a word you hear a lot is escalation.
Mm-hmm.
It refers to that gradual increase in the intensity of a conflict.
Right.
Think of it as stairs. Each step takes you high and higher, but also makes it harder to turn back.
It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It gets bigger and picks up speed, and it becomes harder and harder to stop.
That's a great visualization. And then you have the idea of deterrence, which is really important to NATO's strategy. It's about showing strength and resolve to stop an enemy from attacking.
So it's like having a guard dog, just its presence alone can scare away intruders.
Exactly. But deterrence only works if the other side really believes you'll back up your words with action, and that's where the uncertainty about NATO comes into play.
Right.
If Russia doesn't think NATO will act, deterrence doesn't really work.
It's like a game of chicken. Whoever backs down first loses.
Right.
But the stakes here are so high.
Exactly. And let's not forget about concessions. That word comes up a lot when people talk about peace negotiations.
Okay?
Concessions are compromises. Each side gives something up to reach an agreement.
Like bargaining at the market.
Yeah,
You have to find a price that both the buyer and seller agree on.
that's a good analogy, but in this case, the price could be land or political independence, even human lives.
Right.
The question of what each side is willing to give up is usually the hardest part of negotiations,
Yeah.
and the outcome can have huge consequences.
It's high-stakes poker with the fate of nations on the line.
Right, and speaking of high stakes, let's shift back to Russia for a minute.
Okay.
We talked about their economic troubles and their strained military, but there's another thing we haven't really explored: their demographic crisis.
Right, their population is shrinking and their workforce is getting older.
Exactly.
It's like they're running out of players for their team.
That's a great way to put it. And this demographic crisis is even worse now because of the war in Ukraine. Young men who would normally be working and starting families are dying or leaving the country.
Right.
This has really serious implications for Russia's economy in the long run and their ability to keep fighting.
So even if they win some kind of military victory, they could still lose in the end.
Exactly. It's a Pyrrhic victory, a win that comes at too high a price. And this demographic time bomb, along with their economic problems and their depleted military, paints a pretty bleak picture of Russia's future.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that wars aren't just won or lost on the battlefield. The consequences are much more complex and long-lasting.
It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube.
Uh-huh.
Every time you think you're close to a solution, another layer of complexity pops up.
That's perfect. It shows how we need to approach this issue with humility and nuance and be open to different perspectives. We can't oversimplify things or jump to conclusions.
Right, we need to avoid black and white thinking and accept that there are a lot of gray areas that make this situation so difficult.
Absolutely. And we need to be aware of our own biases and how they might affect how we see things.
It's like looking through tinted glasses. We have to
Yeah.
be aware of the color they're adding to our vision.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to look at different viewpoints and be willing to challenge our own assumption.
Like eating a balanced diet, we need different nutrients to stay healthy, and we need different perspectives to stay informed.
That's a great analogy. It shows how important it is to get information from many sources and talk to people who have different views.
Right, it's not about winning an argument, it's about learning more and challenging what we think we know.
Precisely. And that's really what this deep dive is all about: encouraging critical thinking, promoting discussion, and helping people understand the complicated challenges facing our world today.
We've covered a lot, but there's still so much more to explore before we wrap up this part of our deep dive. I want to leave our listeners with another thought-provoking question.
Okay.
We've been talking about a bigger conflict in Europe, but what if the real danger is somewhere else?
Ooh, I love that you got me curious. Tell me more.
So while everyone's focused on Ukraine and NATO, there might be other global hotspots that are kind of simmering, ready to erupt into big crises that could pull in major world powers.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like we're so busy putting out one fire that we don't see the embers smoldering somewhere else.
Exactly. While we're all worried about this one potential conflict, other threats could be popping up without us noticing, and those could be just as dangerous, maybe even more so.
Right. It's like playing whack-a-mole. You knock one down and another one pops up somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. And it reminds us that we need to be paying attention to all sorts of potential problems, not just the ones that are all over the news right now. So besides Europe, where else should we be looking?
So one place is the South China Sea that's a real powder keg just waiting for a spark.
Right.
China is getting more and more assertive about those disputed islands and waterways, and that's making people worry about a possible conflict with their neighbors and even countries like the U.S.
The South China Sea is so complicated. Everyone wants something there.
Right.
And it seems like any little mistake could escalate things really quickly. And then there's all the instability in the Middle East.
Yeah, that region just can't seem to find any lasting peace.
It's like a tangled mess of alliances and enemies, and then you add in all the historical baggage and religious tensions, and it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, the Syrian civil war, the conflict in Yemen, the situation in Iraq, it's like Any one of those could blow up and pull in other countries.
And we can't forget about climate change,
Right.
which just makes everything worse as resources become more scarce and natural disasters displace people. We're going to see more competition and conflict over things like land and water.
Yeah, it's a slow motion disaster happening right in front of us, and it could cause widespread chaos and conflict on a scale we've never seen before.
And even though these threats might seem totally separate,
Yeah,
they're actually all connected. A crisis in one place can easily spill over into another
right.
and create this domino effect that destabilizes whole regions or even the whole world.
It's a reminder that we're all connected and that what happens in one part of the world can affect everyone.
Absolutely. So it's not just about dealing with each crisis separately, it's about understanding how everything is linked globally and coming up with ways to promote stability and cooperation.
Right. We need to move away from this idea that for someone to win, someone else has to lose.
Yeah.
And then realize that security is something we all share.
It sounds like a huge task,
It is.
but one that we can't ignore if we want to create a more peaceful and sustainable future.
That's the goal, isn't it? To build a world where we can face these problems together and peacefully and realize that we're all human and we share the same fate.
So, how do we actually get there? What can we do to build a more resilient and interconnected world?
Well, it starts with talking to each other and building trust. We need to create places where people from different backgrounds can come together, share their ideas, and find things they agree on.
It's about building bridges, not walls, understanding that our differences make us stronger, not weaker.
Exactly. And we also need to put more effort into diplomacy and resolving conflicts peacefully.
hmm
We need the tools and skills to work out our disagreements without violence, finding solutions that work for everyone involved.
Moving past this idea that there always has to be a winner and a loser,
Right.
and instead looking for win-win solutions.
Exactly. And we need to support organizations that are already working towards peace development and cooperation around the world, like the United Nations, the World Bank, and all the NGOs out there. They're doing such important work and they need our help.
It's like weaving a safety net.
Yeah,
The more threads we have, the stronger it will be, and the better we'll be able to catch those who fall through the cracks.
that's a beautiful way to put it. And it reminds us that everyone can do something to help create a more peaceful and sustainable world. Even small actions can make a difference.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
Just stay curious, stay involved, and stay hopeful. The challenges we face are huge, but we can overcome them by working together with open minds and a commitment to peace and understanding we can create a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.
That's a great message. And on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into geopolitics. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more informed we are, the better prepared we'll be to navigate these difficult times.
Until next time, stay curious.